Welcome to our episode of Biblical Archaeology, From the Ground Down. Presented by Bible Interact and hosted by Dr. George Sparks. Join us as we explore the fascinating world of the Bible from leading experts in the field of archaeology.
Good morning, my name is Dr. George Sparks, and with me today I have Dr. David Graves, PhD. And we are going to be talking about Ephesus. Now, Dr. Graves taught at Oxford University, also professor at Liberty University School of Divinity. He has traveled extensively throughout the Middle East. Also, he's been at locations like Mount Ararat, that's right, Noah's Ark, the Temple Mount, Qumran, if you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, also Shiloh, all these locations except for Mount Ararat in Israel, but also Tel El Hammam in Jordan, where he was my big supervisor many years ago when we all had hair together. But anyway, today we're going to talk about one of the seven churches. In his book, Jesus Speaks to the Seven Churches, and it's going to be Ephesus.
Ephesus is one of the seven churches mentioned in Revelation chapter 2 and known today as the Turkish city of Selçuk. It is an interesting site with extensive archaeological remains. Strabo considered it second only to Rome in importance, with a maximum population of 90,000. Dr. Graves, in the tradition of Sir William Ramsay and Colin Hemmer, has identified several local references in the message to Smyrna recorded in Revelation which are very informative. The references include such items as the silted harbor that may be reflected in Revelation chapter 2 verse 2 that states, deeds, hard work and perseverance, reflected in constant work of dredging carried out to keep the harbor from silting. Although in the late 19th century many scholars believed that the Ephesian riot account presented by Luke in Acts 19 was a fabrication, it has now been shown that no less than 8 historical references or terms that occur in Acts chapter 19 have been verified by archaeological inscriptions. Of note are the first 3, beginning with the Ephesian inscription of the silversmith. It has been suggested that the commercial agora was where Paul worked in tent-making and leatherwork with Priscilla and Aquila mentioned in Acts 18. Also, it has been suggested that this was where Demetrius, the silversmith, who crafted the statues of Artemis, had his shop. 8 inscriptions, mentioning the association of silversmiths, had been located in Ephesus, one of which was located on a column along the Arcadian Way near the theater, beside the commercial agora. The Temple of Artemis was built by Croesus, the rich king of Lydia in 550 BC over a period of 120 years. It was known as the Artemision and located just outside of Ephesus. It was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Artemision was one of the largest Greek temples ever built and the first temple to be constructed out of marble. In 356 BC, the Temple of Artemis was destroyed by arson. A man by the name of Herostratus set fire to the wooden roof beams, seeking fame. For this outrage, the Ephesians sentenced the perpetrator to death and forbade anyone from mentioning his name, known as damnatio memoriae, but historian Theopompus later preserved his legacy. In Greek and Roman historical tradition, the temple's destruction coincided with the birth of Alexander the Great. The foundation of the temple's altar was discovered outside the temple in 1965 and visible on one of its coins. The final temple was destroyed by the Goths in AD 262 and never reconstructed. All that remains today of the once magnificent Artemision is a single column from the 5th temple built on the site, although many of the sculptured sections of the temple, excavated by Wood in Hogarth, were shipped to the British Museum. The imperial temple of the emperors, called the Sebastoi, was dedicated to the family of emperors Vespasian, Titus and Domitian and dates to AD 89 or 90. Artemis, or in Latin called Diana, was a popular mythical Greek goddess worshipped throughout the Roman Empire, but particularly in Asia Minor and Ephesus. Artemis is often depicted with a short skirt carrying a bow and arrow and accompanied with a hunting dog or deer. Homer describes Artemis of the wilds, the huntress, and mistress of animals. In Greek mythology, she was the daughter of Zeus and twin sister of Apollo. She was the virgin goddess of the hunt, wild animals, childbirth, virginity, and thus associated with various animals such as lions, bulls, rams, deer, and bees. The second scheduled mission of NASA's Artemis program is named after the Greek goddess and the first scheduled crewed mission of NASA's Orion spacecraft, currently planned to be launched by the Space Launch System in November 2024. 4 astronauts are to perform a flyby of the Moon and return to Earth, being the first crewed mission beyond low Earth orbit since Apollo 17 in 1972. The mission was called Artemis because she was the goddess of the Moon. The theater of Ephesus is the largest in Asia Minor, with a capacity of about 24,000 people. It was the site of the famous riot against the preaching of Paul, which had negatively affected the businesses of the craftsmen of Artemis statue, led by Demetrius the silversmith described in Acts 19. Perhaps the most famous structure in Ephesus is the Library of Celsus, however it was not in existence at the time of Paul's visit. Although the gate was already standing and Paul likely passed through their arches. All our books are listed on our website smyrnaean.blogspot.com and can be found on amazon.com.
We're going to start with the Temple of Artemis now. And the Temple of Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, built by Croesus, the king of Lydia, in 550 BC. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, one of the largest Greek temples that was ever built. So it's pretty impressive. They've reconstructed it actually in another country, so you can get an idea of what it looked like, but all it remains is a single pillar in the excavations at Ephesus. But it was excavated by John Wood and David Hargarth in 1965. They discovered the temple altar that's actually pictured on one of the coins. So it's a very significant spot. And then, of course, it relates to what we have mentioned in the book of Revelation and the book of Acts with the Temple of Artemis. They found a number of these statues. I had a little statue I brought back as a souvenir, if I can get it to, it doesn't want to show.
It shows a little bit and then it goes out there, but we can see it fine right there. That's good. Right
There we are. So this is the Temple of Artemis that is pictured in Ephesus. What's really interesting is that in most places where Artemis was being revered as a goddess, she's pictured as a huntress, the god of the moon, the forest, and hunting, and usually pictured with a dog or a deer with a bow and arrow in her hand. But here in Ephesus, she's pictured with these many breasts. Now, scholars debate whether they are breasts, beehives, bull scrotum. There's been all kinds of speculation as to what they might represent and whether she's actually a depiction of sexual promiscuity or sex cult or something that was being promoted in Ephesus or not. And scholars are still arguing over that fact. One thing I found really interesting is that the new NASA astronauts that are going to the moon are called Artemis II. Why? Because she's the goddess of the moon. And we have a crew that even includes a Canadian. So I thought that was really interesting that they named the new NASA excavation after the goddess Artemis. Now, the goddess and Artemis, as I said, was unique and preeminently the city of astrology and sorcery, incantations, exorcisms, and a variety of magical arts. And we see these depicted in many of the coins, the statues that have been excavated, including we have a sidewalk scene of welcome to the brothel. She was the priestess of Artemis, was involved, some speculate, with the religious connections with the prostitution at the brothel. And on the street, you can see a foot and one of the ladies pointing the direction toward the brothel.
I have a question real quick then.
Yeah.
I'm not going to take this serious at all, But you said you used the word religion in the same sentence as brothel. There's a connection as a fertility. Would it be like a synagogue or a church being attached to a brothel? We're being nice by using the word brothel, you know. But in terms today, that'd be kind of like having a religious cult of, we'll just say fertility, but really prostitution in the religious system itself. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is that we have a secret passage that ran from the library of Celsus to the brothel.
Now that's fun. Okay.
Honey, I'm going to the library. So that's what they were doing. They had a passage where they was easy access. So Ephesus was known for its promiscuous conduct. It's very easy to see the references in the book of Ephesians to the promiscuity and immorality that was going on in the city. And that was commonplace in many of the ancient Roman cities. So we move on now to the great theater. And it was huge. I mean, it probably could house, it was the largest theater actually in Asia Minor, 154 meters, built in the 3rd century BC, expanded and enlarged by Emperor Claudius in 41 to 54, and renovated by Nero and Trajan. So it was a happening place. And this is where everybody would gather, hear concerts and do their thing. Now, what's interesting is that on the Arcadian Way, the street that leads to the harbor, from that theater, we have an inscription that talks about the silversmith. Now, Acts chapter 19 talks about Demetrius, the silversmith, who is making the statues to Artemis. And this is the theater in which Paul went, and for 2 hours they yelled and proclaimed, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," in protest against Paul's preaching against the silversmiths. So we have a statue mentioning silversmiths. We have the theater where all of this took place, confirmed in the book of Acts, chapter 19, 23 to 41. I think that's pretty interesting.
It is. It really is.
So what, and that specific term is actually used in the book of Acts. So Luke knew his geography, he knew his history, he knew what was happening in the city of Ephesus. We have also excavated the terrace houses. These were the more affluent and wealthy families that were living there. Some very beautiful mosaics and some very beautiful paintings on the walls that they've excavated. That's not always open to the public, but there's some amazing photographs of that. The next thing to talk about of Ephesus probably is the Library of Celsus. Now, this was not something that Paul saw because it wasn't built until 135 AD, well after the time of Paul. However, the gate of Machaerus in Mithridates was built in the 3rd BC. So it would have been in existence when Paul visited it, and he would have likely walked through those gates into the commercial agora that it leads to. So while the library wasn't there at Paul's time, those gates existed. And that's rather interesting. What else can we say about Ephesus? Well, the Library of Celsus is the most photographed image probably that everybody recognizes. It's what's behind me on my portrait or my image right now. As you look at me, behind me is the Library of Celsus, some 2 stories high. They had 4 different educulae, their little inserts where they would put statues. We have a statue to Sophia of wisdom. The next one is the statue of science. The next one of intelligence. and the next one of excellence. And so that's what you would see there. And it had the scrolls inside that would be storing all of the scrolls that were available at the library at that period of history. And there's other things you can see there. There's a menorah in one of the seats in the theater, and there's a couple of churches that have been built in the area, and they're rather interesting as well because we have possibly the burial place of John, the Apostle John, who wrote the book of Revelation. So you can go to the church there of St. John, traditionally holds John's remains. It's a basilica it's rather old, 548 to 565 AD, for the time of built in Justinian's period. But it's significant that we have this place. Though something that is rather interesting, I don't know if there's any historical significance or value to it or concrete evidence to it, but Artemis was worshipped in the city, and this was we have the Church of St. Mary, the Virgin Mary, the double church, and the House of Mary there as well at the site. So the tradition of the Virgin Mary and the goddess of Artemis, a woman, are found at the same place. Is there a connection between those two things? Perhaps. Easy to worship the Virgin Mary in a city or an area where Artemis was revered as a goddess. So that may be some connection to that as well. So that's my tour of Ephesus. There's many, many, many other artifacts. The Temple of the Imperial Cults are there, of Hadrian. Those can also be visited. It's probably one of the most excavated sites in all of Turkey, and probably the next one might be Jerash in Jordan, where we have a Roman site that's been excavated to that kind of a level. So, important site, has a lot to offer, and tells us a lot about what's going on in the text in the book of Revelation with the message to Ephesus.
When you were talking about they saw a menorah, or the menorah was carved in the stone.
The Apostle John has traditionally been buried at Ephesus, and he was the one who took care of his mother until she died. And so
that's
his
why mother, you're talking about Jesus, right?
Jesus's mother, Mary, and that's why the Virgin Mary is venerated in Ephesus. And so there you have a connection that fits very well with easy to venerate Mary when you are also venerating goddess Artemis in that city.
Right. Now, I don't hear anybody talk about this. This is interesting because at the cross, Jesus looks at John and says something like, "Behold your mother, behold your son." And from that, it does record that John was watching over Mary. Okay, now this explains it. All right,
there's the connection. Yes,
there's a great connection. In your book, Jesus speaks to the 7 churches. It's a reference to the book of Revelation, correct?
Yes.
And in the book of Revelation, it says the Spirit speaks to the church, and so that means there must have been a church there at the first century. And it says it usually has a pro and a con. I like this, but I don't like that.
That's right.
There might be an area in the church that needs to be corrected.
Yes.
Was there an amalgamation being suggested in the book of Revelation that the church of Ephesus is too worldly? To put it in like a modern metaphor.
Yes, well, chapter 2 of Revelation, verse 4 says, I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. So there's evidence that the Ephesian church had abandoned their love for Christ or for God that they had at first. And so there's this idea of synchronization, of syncretism with the belief systems that was around them, and they were embracing it and taking it into the Christian church. Not unlike our modern world and our modern churches, where we've embraced much of the what would we say, wokeism of our culture, and brought that into our modern day church.
Right. But I find it fascinating because we have a book that was written 2,000 years ago, or I should
Yes.
say, we say a book, a letter, Revelation.
Yep.
And it actually, it's what it talks about is not so different than what's going on today.
Exactly.
So but I think I don't know if you would agree with this, is the book of Revelation actually talking to us? Now we can use it, we can look at it and say, this could apply to us because there's similarities within cultures and activities. But when we look at the book of Revelation, is it speaking to those people then? Should we use it as if it is speaking to us today? And this is just a question. What, in your opinion?
I think what we need to look at is, how did it refer to the first century, and what did it mean to the first century readers, how they would have understood it, and then we would understand the meaning of the text, and then we can apply it to ourselves in our own cultural context today. The Christians in the early church were living under the Roman authorities, the Roman government. We live in our modern day under our own governments, our own rulers, our own emperors, if you will. And how should we respond as Christians in the 21st century as the Christians did in the first century? And I think that's where we have the applications, the difference between interpretation and application.
You know, with the archaeology and your insight, it makes that world more alive and more reasonable for us to understand. And also the letter to that church in the book of Revelation, what that exactly means.
If we go back and we understand what it meant for the first century in their context, and understand what it referred to then, we can better apply it to our own cultural context today. Figure out what it meant then, and then you can apply it to what it actually should help us today.
Right. I just found this very interesting to look at that culture from a more realistic point of view, not just my imagination of what was going on because of a letter that was written to them, which would be several, if you will, paragraphs long in the book of Revelation. You know.
John knew the cities inside out. He'd been there, he's visited them, he's seen them.